Michael, good to see you. What do you make of this reporting regarding Ukraine, Russia, and the United States?
Yeah, I mean, we know that Steve Witkoff was talking to Kirill Dimitrov in Miami for about a week, relatively, not secretly, but discreetly. We don't really know what they were discussing until stuff started to leak out yesterday. And then a bit of a novelty that the United States was sending Dan Driscoll, who's the civilian secretary to the army, first of all to Ukraine first of all to Germany for a briefing, then to Ukraine, where he is now. And he's also got with him the Army Chief of Staff, General Randy George, and also Chris Donahue, who's the Army Chief of US forces in Europe. So you've got two four-star generals there who will know the military situation. I imagine that they'll be talking a lot to Keith Kellogg, who's still in Kiev. So you've got three military people there in Kiev who will have a good sense of the situation. And then Dan Driscoll talking to, as we said a moment ago, Yulia Sviridenko, who's the Ukrainian Prime Minister. So obviously the diplomacy behind all this is ramping up. But what we are told, and this may turn out not to be entirely true, but what is being briefed is a 28-point peace plan, which is not really a peace plan, but a surrender document. Because if you look at the terms that are being briefed, then the Ukrainians give territory, the Russians give nothing. The Ukrainians reduce their military, which makes them even more vulnerable to Russia's next move than they are at the moment. And then there's other sweeteners reportedly in it about the status of the Russian language in Ukraine, the status of the Orthodox Church in Ukraine, the fact that Ukraine will be forbidden to have any foreign troops, any friendly troops on its territory. So it's a complete undermining of the sovereignty of what would be the rest of Ukraine, even after they've given away the rest of the Donbass under these proposals. So ultimately, the Russians are giving nothing. The Americans look as if they're going to push this on Ukraine and say, this is your best chance, settle for this now or lose even more territory in the next year.
It's going to be a tricky pill to swallow for the Ukrainians. We spoke last hour to the chair of the Foreign Affairs Committee in Kiev, who said, look, we just couldn't agree to any of this.
No, I'm sure they won't. They won't, because it's a surrender document and it would leave them massively vulnerable to whatever the Russians are going to do next. And I promise you the Russians will be doing something next. Maybe not in 6 months' time or a year's time. Maybe they'd leave it till the end of the Trump administration. But they absolutely have not given up the ambition to absorb the whole of Ukraine. So the Ukrainians know that. I think they'll feel that they've got no choice but to go along with the idea of talks. And Zelensky has been saying since March he will have talks with Putin. It's Putin who won't have talks with Zelensky. It's the Russians who say there's nothing to talk about. So I think that the Ukrainians will, as it were, say, look, we can talk about anything you like if you want to have direct talks. But privately, they're never going to agree to most of what appears to be in this document. And privately, the Europeans will back up the idea that, of course, talks are a good idea. But on this basis, they won't believe that they can get anywhere. And the Europeans will want to back up the Ukrainians in resisting the idea that they be pushed into signing this sort of surrender document.
What do you make of what the Kremlin appears to have achieved here? Because this, is being drawn up by the US and Russia, but it feels as though it could really just be printed on Kremlin letterhead.
Absolutely. I mean, this is what happens. I mean, President Trump and the Trump administration goes around in circles on this whole process. I mean, they pressured Russia over sanctions on the two biggest oil companies, Rosneft and Lukoil, and that bothered the Russians. And they pressured Russia over the prospect, only the prospect, that they would supply Tomahawk missiles to Kiev. And in both cases, the Russians immediately got in touch with the White House and wanted to talk. So it shows that President Trump does have leverage. But whenever he realizes he's got this leverage, he doesn't actually use it. Because whenever there is a direct talk certainly between Putin and President Trump, and between Witkoff and more or less anybody in the Russian administration, they come away with Russian talking points. They come away with having gone on to the Russian side of the argument that somehow they've got a right to keep part of Ukraine, they've got a right to restrict the sovereignty of Ukraine, they've got a right to put more and more pressure on Kiev, even though, as the world knows, the Russians are outright aggressors in this case. So every time the Americans go in a circle, whenever it comes to direct discussions with the Russians come away with having manipulated the Americans to the point they want to get them to. Which is why I'm sure none of this will work I go back to what I've been saying since March, that President Trump is zigzagging his way out of involvement in this war. The way in which he zigzags his way out of it will depend on who he blames for the failure of his efforts. And who he blames will have a big effect on how much help or not the Americans are prepared to continue to give to Ukraine as Ukraine continues fighting.
And alongside all of this, we've got to bear in mind the European Union, the UK as well, EU foreign ministers meeting and that kind of clamour to get a voice in part of this, because the amount of support that the European Union and other aligned countries are given is massive. The geographical and strategic impact is bigger for them than it is for the United States. What will these leaders be able to achieve in this situation, if anything?
Well, what they're all doing is pretending that they believe in this peace plan, because they have to. They have to humour President Trump because of the way the man is. So they have to humour him and pretend that this is a great possibility, and they'll back any possibility. Peace is a good idea. Privately, they don't believe any more than I do that it will work. And so they know that ultimately they're going to have to try to back up Ukraine fighting on alone with the Europeans. And the question of how much American support or not will be given to Ukraine in the future is a major issue. So they can't afford to dissent from Washington. So, as it were, they back up everything that Trump says in the hope, the vain hope that it will work. But privately, they don't believe it will work. And what they're all doing is making their contingency plans for when President Trump finally exits from this whole conflict.
It's interesting times. We always appreciate you distilling them for us. Michael, always good to see you. Thank you so much.